Okay. Hi, I want to talk about funny stuff. In particular, my quest for understanding my question of what is the importance of communicating humor? Through indulging the pleasant readings and studies of various uses of humor in our communication, I have found a literature gap in our understanding of humor. In particular, there is no scientific study that looks at stress as one of the potential variables for engaging in disparaging humor. Oh, what is disparaging humor, I hear you say? Well, my eager viewer, disparaging humor is a type of humor that tends to demean and berate individuals or groups. This includes humor that is sexist, racist, homophobic, and many more that discriminates on groups of people for their features. Now we know what the disparagement humor is. I really recommend remembering this term because I'll be using it a lot in this video. Let's go deeper into understanding why I think this is a valuable topic to investigate. What would an undergraduate student do if they find a gap in the science? If you have guessed that they would conduct a full-on proper research and publish a paper about it to the whole wide world, then you are wrong. Nobody wants an undergrad to publish a paper without a professor backing them up. So I went ahead and just proposed. I wanted to do a research proposal on the relationship between stress and disparaging humor. In that proposal I asked myself a question. How likely am I to make fun of people that really annoy me? And this is where I base my hypothesis as follows. If my stress is caused by a particular group of people, then I will engage in disparaging humor against that specific group of people to alleviate my stress. This hypothesis is based from the research that looked at the effects and causes of disparagement humor. There are various factors that are currently studied to see what encourages people to engage with disparaging humor. I argue that all the research inhibit the same factor, the sense of threat, which results in increased stress levels. I don't mean the research is making participants to fight lions for their life and then making them to read jokes to see how much their stress reduced. The threat I'm talking about is directed towards person's identity. For example, a study by O'Connor et al. In 2017 found that men who highly value their masculinity status and are told that they have a feminine sense of humor are more likely to enjoy sexist and anti-gay humor compared to men who don't value their masculinity as highly as them. The study concluded that men who highly value their masculinity are feeling threatened by any signs of femininity and will be more likely to make jokes against representatives of femininity and gay men. This study alone is a clear example of a threat encouraging the use of disparaging humor. I argue that men who have enjoyed sexist and anti-gay humor could have been feeling stressed about their identity being associated with femininity. While it reveals how fragile masculinity could be, it also reveals that people could be fighting their stress source with the use of disparaging humor. Additionally, this study is also supported by other researchers who found that men who also highly value their masculinity and score highly on the sexism scale perceived feminist women to be more of a threat than women who did not describe themselves to be a feminist. This even furthers the idea that masculinity is fragile, but also it tells us that men would use sexist humor to fight off masculinity threats, the very threat that would stress them out. Starting to see the pattern here, are we? Besides men using sexist humor against women and gays, we also know that people would use disparaging humor on the controversial groups in the society. One study showed that when Americans engage in anti-Muslim jokes, they become more discriminatory towards Muslims after being exposed to those jokes. This, my friend, tells me that Americans still see Muslims as somewhat of a threat due to 9/11 that damaged their reputation, which makes them more likely to use disparaging humor on them and increase their discriminations on Muslims even more, but at the cost of potentially reducing their stress. Why do I keep saying that disparaging humor reduces stress? Well, we have the knowledge that humor, and especially self-enhancing humor, is effective at reducing stress before anxious events. Basically, if positive humor can reduce stress, could a negative one also have the same property? The reason why I believe that disparaging humor is effective at reducing stress is because of how it aligns with three psychological theories: social identity theory, prejudice norm theory, and social model of prejudice. For the purposes of this video, I will only give a brief description of these theories, but I do encourage you to investigate those theories for yourself, for they are very interesting. I will provide the sources in the description. So, to shortly describe the theories. Social identity theory tells us that people strive to maintain positive image of themselves, of which could be a comparison between other people. One way increasing self-image is making other groups as butt of your jokes. Prejudice norm theory tells us that people, especially those who are already prejudiced, who share disparaging humor with each other, become more tolerable towards discrimination of the group that they're making fun of. This theory helps to explain why disparaging humor is acceptable in some cases and in other cases not. Social model of prejudice. This theory explains criteria that makes a social group into a controversial group in society. These groups are found to be more likely to be targeted by disparaging humor compared to those who are not controversial. With all this research, I came to believe that stress does have an impact in encouraging people to use disparaging humor in order to reduce the stress. Thus, I plan to make a study that examines this relationship. My experiment. By conducting some fancy math calculations called power analysis, I was able to determine that I would need about 356 participants in order to see a medium-sized effect if my hypothesis were true. In my grand experiment, participants will be intentionally put through a stressful test. In particular, they will be put through a trier social stress test, or shortly TSST. Before TSST starts, a saliva sample will be taken to measure resting cortisol levels. To clarify, a cortisol is a hormone that comes from the adrenal gland, which could be triggered by physical or mental stress. By measuring cortisol levels, it helps me to detect a physiological response to stress throughout the experiment. TSST consists of participants going through a scenario where they must prepare a 5-minute speech about why they are suited for their dream job within the 15 minutes that they're given. After 15 minutes are up, they are put in a room with judges that are specifically trained not to give off any facial expression or emotion to the participants while they present. If the participants finishes their speech before 5 minutes are up, they will be asked to continue with their speech until 5 minutes are done. After that, they are asked to move to another room where a final phase takes place. In this phase, they are to count backwards from 1,220 by counts of 13 for another 5 minutes. If they make any mistake, they'll be asked to start again. It is deliberately made hard to frustrate the participants and increase their stress levels. Typically, after the last step of the TSST, the participants will be left alone in a room to rest. But in my experiment, they will engage in a scenario where they did get employed to their dream job, but with a twist. They have a terrible boss that will eventually become a target for their jokes. You might be asking, why do we target bosses? Well, my curious friend, I believe that category of bosses and CEOs fit within the controversial group as described by social prejudice model. They have the power to impose a threat on the financial stability of the employees, as an average employee in US would have to work 1,000 years to earn the salary that CEOs or bosses produce within a year. Hence, I find boss figurehead to be imposing enough to be a threat and also to be potentially a controversial figure to an average employee. After reading the bad boss scenario, yes, that's how I named it, I will take their saliva to measure their cortisol levels after a stressful event. Depending on the group that participants belong in, they will either engage in neutral or disparaging jokes about the bosses in order to reduce their stress levels. The saliva sample will be taken straight after they've finished reading the jokes. Overall, the aim is to collect 3 saliva samples before the experiment, after the stressful event, and after reading the jokes. By comparing how much cortisol levels got changed throughout these steps, it would help me to understand how impactful disparaging humor is compared to the neutral humor. If my hypothesis were to be right, then I would see the greater reduction in cortisol after reading disparaging jokes. Yet, regardless of the results, the study would provide us with knowledge that will benefit all of us, in particular in our understanding of how to counter the use of disparaging humor. This helps us to prepare strategies to stop bullying, shaming, or any other kind of activities that divides groups through uses of humor. Hence, that is my research proposal, folks. Please be aware that this is a short description of my project, and almost everything that I have said could be explained even further in greater detail. I encourage you to look at my reference list or at my written research proposal to understand more about what I've talked. I appreciate your attention, and hopefully this project will come to life once I manage to get into the grad school, where my future mentor will find value in my proposal and assist me with finding answers within the literature gap of humor psychology. See ya.